What is up, everybody? I'm back, and I'm here with you today to talk about the way I interpret Thomas Aquinas. Now, I have been reading Thomas for about a year now, casually in my free time. I've been reading some of the secondary lit. So don't take this as the cut and dry, here's the way to do it, here's the way to read Thomas. No, that's not it. This is just my reflections on a year of studying him. And it takes about 10 years to get to fully understand Thomas, I think. At least from what I've been reading, that's kind of the timeline that I put on it, and it's also what other people have said. So with that in mind, let's just get into a few things that I have found. I'm going to give you three basic things that what I have found, and hopefully these help you to understand Thomas on your own. And also, this is it's some of this is going to change, so maybe in a year I won't fully subscribe to what I say today, but I think that generally speaking, what I say here is probably what I will hold throughout the rest of my life. Probably, unless I have some serious changes, because all the things that I've come here to today that I'm going to mention are, I think, I'm pretty sure that they're correct, and I'm convinced by the arguments, but we'll get into that, and I'll mention some of the things that I'm a bit sketchy on. So let me talk first about some of the schools of Thomistic interpretation. So there are different schools of interpreting Thomas, and the first one, and I'm going to mention, there are a bunch that I'm not very familiar with, and there are a couple that I am. So the ones I'm not familiar with are Transcendental Tomism, Neoscholasticism or Neoscholastic Thomism, and phenomenological Thomism. So what are these? Transcendental Tomism is basically the method that Karl Rahner and Bernard Lonergan use, and they emphasize they try to reconcile Thomas with Kant and Descartes. And so they're going to be, I don't know much about them, so I don't want to say too much, but they seem to me to be focusing more on the theology of Thomas and not doing as much with the metaphysics and the natural theology. So yeah, there's them. You can go check that on your own. Rahner's book, I think, Spirit in the World, that's an interesting one, because Rahner actually did his dissertation on Heidegger, and they rejected it. And I think that was Spirit in the World, and it turned into one of the greatest theological texts of the 20th century. And then he actually wrote his dissertation on something else, and that got accepted. Anyway, that's a funny story about Rahner. So that's a school. Phenomenological Thomism, don't know much about it at all. Didn't even know it was a thing until I was researching for this video. Apparently Pope John Paul II, Karl Wojtyla, was a phenomenological Thomist. I think that they emphasize the method of Edmund Husserl and apply it to Thomas's account of the person. Feel free to check that on your own. Now, what was the other one that I mentioned? Transcendent Neoscholasticism, yes. I do not know much about that. I think that I know Garrigou-Lagrange was a great exponent of it, but I think that the basic idea is that they emphasize a strict adherence to Thomas's doctrines. They're very suspicious of any outside elements coming in, such as Kantianism or Cartesianism, and they put a lot of emphasis on the commentators of Thomas, such as Cajetan. Okay, with those in mind, there's also Laval or River Forest Thomism, which really emphasizes the Aristotelian elements of Thomas and places a great deal of emphasis on having a sound basis in the natural sciences before you go on to metaphysics. So metaphysics and the natural sciences are really, really closely connected in this school of Thomas. And you can go and check out some stuff by, I think, Benedict Ashley. And it seems to me that Edward Fazer is a proponent of this school, from what I can tell, but I could be wrong. Feel free to correct me. Then we have Analytic Tomism, which is interesting. So Analytic Tomism, I have read a decent amount of. So Brian Davis, John Haldane, Gila Klima, Anthony Kennedy, Peter Geach, Elizabeth Anscombe, all these people are going to be adherents of this school. Now, this school is interesting because you can't really schematize it. So everything that I say about it's really general, but the most you can kind of say about it is that all the thinkers, what they're doing is they're applying the methods and kind of tools of contemporary 20th and 21st century analytic philosophy to Thomas. And it's going to differ with each one of these people, but for somebody, for instance, like Anthony Kenny and I disagree with Kenny on almost everything that I've read of his, at least, is he is going to read back the Fregean existential quantifier into Thomas. This is found in his book, Thomas and Being, or something like that, Aquinas on Being, that's it. And so I think that this is actually a terrible move, because Thomas obviously did not have a conception of being like Frege did. And G. Laclima is going to really, really kind of hit Kenny hard on this. But that's just an example of somebody using the methods of analytic philosophy to interpret Thomas. I think in a lot of situations, like from what I've read of Brian Davis, it seems to be great. It seems to work out very well. Whereas for Anthony Kenny, I think that that's a huge, huge error. You should be, and I'll get into this later, you should be approaching a thinker on his own terms. But basically for the Analytic Thomists, they are going to be reading, they're going to be using Wittgenstein, Frege, Michael Dummett, people like that, and kind of interpreting Thomas through those tools and stuff. And then the other school is going to be the Existential Thomists. So that's going to be Jill Sohn, Mary Ton, Joseph Owens, John Nassis, these people. And they emphasize, or they read Thomas through an interpretation which is based on the third chapter of the De Ente and Essentia. And so they're focused on de-emphasizing the Aristotelian components of Thomas and focusing greatly on him being moving well beyond Aristotle and being a very, very influential and original philosopher in his own right. And so they're going to do that by saying that his greatest contribution to philosophy is his distinction between essence and existence. And then there are two other schools that aren't very well known, and which I kind of, they're out there. They're not official schools, I don't really think. But that's going to be kind of like people like Norris Clark, who formulate a more axiomatic style of Thomism. And Clark, what he's going to do is he puts forth this thing called a creative retrieval of Thomism, where he's taking Thomas's stuff and he's formulating it in a very axiomatic or systematic way, working slowly, kind of up a ladder from the principle of sufficient reason and stuff like that, all the way up to arguments for God, and then procession and reversion. And so somebody like Clark is going to be starting with he's going to be using tools from analytic philosophy. He's going to be using tools from phenomenology. He's going to be using tools from Blondel and action theory and Heidegger to synthesize an axiomatic and systematic account of Thomas in a 21st century context. I think this is amazing. It's beautiful. I read his book, The One and the Many, and I was just stunned by it. So go and check him out if you're interested in a really systematic and articulate defense of Thomism from kind of the ground all the way up. Another guy like that is going to be Edward Fazer, and he's going to do that. He's going to take kind of this systematic, axiomatic approach from the ground up in his scholastic metaphysics. That's what it seems to me. And then finally, the school that I sympathize with the most is the Neoplatonic interpreters of Thomas. So these are going to be people like Eric Pearl, Wayne Hankey, and they are going to emphasize the Neoplatonic continuity with Thomas. So that's going to be Plotinus, Proclus, and Pseudo-Dionysius, and their emphasis or their influence on Thomas's theology and metaphysics. Now, let me briefly note, before moving into the second half of this video, that I find a lot of good stuff in all these schools, at least the ones that I've reckoned with. So for instance, I think that Jill Sohn's Existential Tomism is completely, utterly correct insofar as it states that Thomas was not an Aristotelian. He used a lot of stuff from Aristotle, but he went well beyond Aristotle. In his definition of essence is completely different than Aristotle's, and his conception of being is radically different than Aristotle's, because Aristotle in Metaphysics Zeta 2 and 3 defines being as form, whereas famously for Aquinas, being is essence or essentia, and esse, or the act of existence. So Aristotle and Aquinas, they are radically, radically different. They're each these original philosophers. Aquinas obviously draws a lot on Aristotle, but he is going well, well beyond him. It is not the case that he just baptized Aristotle, as some people say. That is completely wrong. Jill Sohn is right, and I think that all Thomistic scholars are going to say that Thomas is novel, original, and went well beyond Aristotle. So I think that's correct. I think for the Analytic Thomists, this emphasis on rigor and clarity and analytic precision is correct. However, I disagree with a lot of their methods, as I pointed out with Kenny. Obviously, I don't want to talk too much about that because each thinker in that tradition is very, very nuanced. Now, for the Neoplatonic Thomistic interpreters, I really think that they're onto something. Mainly because Thomas emphasizes, or he references Pseudo-Dionysius over 1,700 times. He wrote a commentary on the divine names, which is unfortunately at this point not translated into English. Hopefully it'll be out by next year, but it's just a tragedy. And I think that what they do that's the best is they have an extremely, extremely well-rounded historical reading of Thomas, where they place him in this tradition of historical continuity. So Eric Pearl famously places Thomas in this continuity from Parmenides to Plato to Aristotle to Plotinus, Proclus, Augustine, all the way up to Aquinas himself. And so I think that that's 100% correct. And I also think that Aquinas is fundamentally Neoplatonic in his metaphysics. I know this is a big claim, and I'm going to defend this as my videos come out along the way, but I think that Thomas is a fundamentally Neoplatonic thinker. That's kind of where I'm at right now. That's my interpretive method for reading Aquinas, and I'm going to be defending that as I make more and more videos. But I just don't have room to spell that out right here. But that's kind of what I think of Thomas right now. Feel free to disagree with me. We'll argue it out. But kind of that's where I'm at right now. So I'm going to disagree with a lot of the stuff in the other schools, but I'm going to be probably most sympathetic to the Neoplatonic interpreters like Hankey and Eric Pearl. Now, we'll get to that later. Just stay tuned. This is going to be some great stuff in the coming months and over the years. Now, let me give you 5 just brief tips when I'm closing out for interpreting Thomas on your own. These are going to be pretty much non-controversial stuff. You want to use his logic and come to him on his own terms. So he used Aristotelian syllogism, and you are going to want to kind of approach him in that sense. So try to do that. If you need good examples of this, look at his sections on law today that I was actually looking at this morning. So Thomas places his arguments in syllogistic form, where he goes from premise 1, premise 2 to a valid conclusion. And he stacks these syllogisms, he works with them. So when you're reading the Summe and when you're reading his other works, look for these arguments. He's not using these weak-ass arguments like we do today, where he says, oh, well, my intuitions seem to point me to this, and experience seems to point me to this conclusion. No, he's performing deduction after deduction. And to give you an example, when he's arguing for the existence of the natural law and the human law, he doesn't just say, oh, it appears that we have human laws and we have a natural law. And it appears that the eternal law is different than the human laws around here. So therefore, based upon this intuition, we can conclude and posit that there are different types of law. He doesn't argue that way. He argues based on deduction from principles and from previous conclusions. This is a very, very different style of argument than we are used to today. We are very, very much used to arguing from experiences around us. So we'll take experiences that we and others kind of have and use them to make a general conclusion. We're very used to arguing from examples and from experiences to a general conclusion. That's called induction. Aquinas rarely does that. He argues deductively, where he goes from a universal or a general premise and a particular instantiation or something like that to a universal conclusion. So he is arguing in a very different manner. If you want to learn more about that, simply open the Summa Gentiles or the Theologia and look at the way he structures the arguments. One way to think about it is to always keep in mind this form of something like all Jedi use the Force. Luke is a particular Jedi, therefore we can conclude that he uses the Force. In this argument, which is the form that Aquinas uses, you go from a universal premise and a particular premise to a universal conclusion. That's how Aquinas is arguing. So keep that in mind. That's very important to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is, learn the history of philosophy when you're reading Thomas. He was heavily influenced by Dionysius, Aristotle, Plato, all these people. He didn't have access to Plato or Plotinus, but he had access to their interpreters. such as Avicenna and Dionysius, and Proclus at the end of his life. So keep this in mind, read the history of philosophy. It's really, really going to help you understand Thomas. And if you understand Plato, Plotinus, Aristotle, Dionysius, you're going to have a great time understanding Plotinus or Aquinas, much easier time understanding him. And it's going to be really, really positive, and it's going to help you to be just leaps and bounds ahead of other people who try to read him. So take the time to work through other thinkers, not just Thomas himself. Thomas is also systematic. Keep this in mind. Keep in mind that everything that he says is working together as a coherent whole and unity. I think his Summa Theologia is the greatest work of philosophy because it's 2 million words, and every word is worked out and fit into this coherent whole. Keep this in mind. Very important. A way to read Thomas is to just think about how what you're reading fits into his coherent system. And one way to do this is to work through individual passages of Thomas, but also with your other reading, work through some of the secondary lit that gives you a more general overview of what Thomas is doing. So works like Joseph Piper's Guide to Aquinas, Jill Sohn's work on Thomas, his History of Philosophy, Phaser's stuff on Thomas, a lot of this stuff, that's going to be good secondary literature to help you get an overview of what Thomas is doing, and then work through your particular passages in the primary text of Thomas. So then keep in mind also that he wasn't just a theologian. He was a first-rate philosopher up there with Hegel and Kant and Plato and Aristotle. He was a great philosopher. He has his own philosophic system. He worked through it all. He demonstrates with great clarity, rigor, and precision these conclusions, and he argues from philosophical premises and using a philosophic method. He's not just doing theology. So keep that in mind. You don't want to fall into this trap that a lot of people fall into, including some people I've talked to who have PhDs, where you literally say, oh, well, Thomas, he was just a theologian, and you have to believe in God to get anything out of him. No, that's just complete nonsense. Not true at all. And then the last thing I want to mention is just interpret him with charity. And you want to do this with all philosophers. Assume from the get-go that they have something positive to say. Assume from the outset that they have something to contribute, and try to figure out what it is. Interpret them with charity and do your best to piece together what they're saying. So with that in mind, I gave you some info on the different schools of Thomism. You can go off and investigate on your own. I told you a little bit about how I interpret Thomas with these kind of five rules, and also with this kind of school that I consider to be the kind of best way, at least in my thinking right now, of interpreting Thomas. So with that in mind, I hope you get a lot out of this, and I hope you go off and you read some Thomas on your own. Have fun.